Today we got a clash between two of the scariest players of all time, Fischer the Machine versus Tal the Magician. Fischer is in the white corner and starts with his best by test pawn to e4. Tal responds with the sharp Sicilian defense. It's interesting that before this game, the score is 4-0 in favor of Tal, but all of those games were played when Fischer was only 16. Now Fischer is 18 and eager to get his revenge. We're getting into the open Sicilian defense, and after a couple moves, Fischer goes for g3, aiming to fianchetto this bishop and castle. Later, Tal confessed that he was somewhat surprised by this little bit more positional and humble beginning. However, right on the next turn, Fischer goes for a more direct attack, hitting the queen. At first, it may seem like the queen can just go anywhere, but it's not that simple for black, because the queen needs to keep guarding these two crucial squares so that the white knight cannot jump there. And now Fischer continues attacking with the bishop to f4, hitting the queen. Fundamentally, black's got two options, either to cover with a pawn or with a knight. Tal did it with knight to e5, which turns out to be a wrong choice, even though it's certainly not easy to figure out why. And at this point, Fischer played a brilliant move bishop to e2. And I know you might be thinking, Igor, I played this move countless times, and no one ever praised me for that. How come? Well, life's unfair, but it is indeed a brilliant move. In fact, it's so strong that it even sent Stockfish to melt down. At this point, with all the seriousness, Stockfish recommends black to just retreat the knight back, kind of setting it up for the next game. That's how strong the bishop e2 move is. But with all the seriousness, if you think about this position, let's try to comprehend why this move is so beautiful and so strong. Now, seeing this pin and this attack, we would be tempted to play something like queen to d4, adding more pressure to the knight, and then your opponent's quick reply will show us why we're not exactly Fischer. Now we know that if you want to continue your attack and play that tempting move queen d4, you gotta secure this f3 square first. And here's the brilliancy of Fischer. The most natural move to play, since you've played g3 previously aiming to fianchetto the bishop, would be to actually just go ahead and play that move. However, that would be weaker compared to the move that he played, bishop e2, but we'll see why only within a couple moves. Now, in this position, Tal played bishop c5, and we'll get to that in a second. But the main question that Fischer had to consider is how about black playing pawn to a6? Following what we now call Fischer's rule, neutralize opponent's pieces on your side of the board. That would be the most natural move of black. And if white simply had to retreat the knight, black would be perfectly fine. However, white had a strong counter, queen to d4, playing the move that he intended to play. And now he says, okay, you can capture my knight, but in that case, I'm going to capture yours, and you're going to be in trouble, because from there, the bishop will attack the queen, the attack the knight, and black is going down. d6 is the move that black would wish to play, securing his knight in the middle of the board, while the white's knight right here is still attacked. And now, at this crucial point, white would need to find this move, castling. Another trivial-looking move, which is still brilliant, because in this case, we're sacrificing the knight. But in fact, it's not a blunder, because if black captures it, and if he doesn't, he's going to collapse somewhere here. Therefore, capturing the knight is pretty much forced, but now bishop takes e5. And now we can see that castles not only put white king to safety, but also put up this battery along the d-file, which now makes it impossible for black to capture the knight. That will lead to queen d8 checkmate. Alright, then if black can't capture the bishop, what should he do? From here, white threatens to either capture this pawn or capture the knight. The move black might wish to play is something like knight d7, offering white this pawn, but trade off everything on d6 and going into an inferior endgame after a bunch of trades. However, in this case, white had another beautiful move, which would demonstrate why having the bishop right here on e2 was better compared to having it right here on g2, because from e2, you've got one more brilliant follow-up, which is bishop takes b5. But that is insane, if you think about that, how these monsters could foresee all that up front and figure out all these beautiful continuations. Now, the bishop on e5 seems to be hanging badly, but it really isn't. The knight on d7 is pinned, therefore black can't move it. And if he wants to capture the bishop by the pawn, that would fail to bishop takes d7, leading to this quick checkmate. But of course, I understand you could say, Igor, I could mouse slip this move easily myself. Fair enough. Now, Tal played bishop c5, which develops a bishop, but also takes control of this square so that white cannot add his queen into the attack. And now, once again, white needs to come up with something, because if he just plays any trivial move, let's say he castles, Alright, and black can kick the knight back. Then the attack would be over and black would be totally fine. Therefore, if Fischer wants to get his revenge, he needs to be more aggressive and he needs to find something to keep the attack going. He does that by trading on e5 and then continuing with pawn to f4. Somehow this queen on e5 is now running out of squares. Like, it looks like it's in the middle of the board, but it can't go here, can't go here, can't go here, can't go that way, and the pawns are controlling all these squares. All in all, the queen is pushed all the way back to b8. Quite a sad reality, but the queen needs to keep guarding those weaknesses of black. And now Fischer continues with pawn to e5. Now the knight has the same problem. It has no squares forward where it could possibly go to, because white controls all these squares. And therefore, the knight has a sad necessity of moving somewhere back right here. And we can see that Fischer was pretty ruthless in pushing his Fischer random chess. All he wants is black shuffling his pieces along the last rank. By the way, I wonder what would Fischer say if he knew that nowadays they call his Fischer random a freestyle chess.
I knew I was the best, but they kept saying this all the time. He's putting me down, they got me mad.
Having said that, Tal was not the kind of a person to back down, and instead of retreating his knight, he responded with a counter-strike. The problem for black, though, is that after these trades, white can now get one extra pawn on g7 and hit the rook. Therefore, the rook moves. Now, the situation remains to be very intense. Black wants to get this pawn out of g7, but Fischer continues attacking with knight to e4, with a double threat to the bishop and also threatening to jump right here to f6, forking the king and rook. Therefore, Tal retreats bishop to e7 to also cover that square. But that also enables Fischer to go queen d4, developing a queen and protecting that super advanced pawn on g7. However, Tal responded with a very unusual attacking move, rook a4. Somehow, I love it a lot. You rarely see a move like that where black would attack with a rook along the a file, skewering the queen and knight. Very interesting. That only got possible because that a6 pawn got moved to b5, and now there is this rook a4. Very interesting idea. Now, if white had to go back, again, black would be able to capture that advanced pawn on g7, would be totally fine. But to this, Fischer also responds with a counter-strike, knight to f6, checking the black king. That's why I love this game. They both played very creative and aggressive chess. It's also interesting that they actually were friendly and had a lot of respect to each other. During the candidates next year, when Tal was hospitalized, Fischer was the only chess player who visited Tal at the hospital. Although, knowing Fischer, he might have brought Tal a poisoned pawn. The game continues. Black needs to take away the knight, therefore securing his king. White recaptures, and now black goes queen to c7. Potentially getting ready to defend his f7 pawn, because white was threatening bishop h5, capturing right here with a checkmate. Even though, when it comes to Tal, you never know, because he was generally speaking willing to sacrifice everything, and maybe he was fine to sacrifice his king, but to go for this counterattack, maybe Fischer was unsure about that, or maybe Fischer just decided to follow that ancient Sun Tzu quote, I don't know, I'm just gonna castle, and in this crazy position he simply castled. How come that simple move is a brilliant move once again? Life is unfair, I understand, we've been casting so many times, no one ever gave us a brilliant move for that, but here the truth is, black can and he did capture this pawn on a2, which looks extremely scary for white, and that is why white's casting is a very interesting decision. But now the trick is, Fischer plays king b1, attacking the rook and kicking it out. In the game, Tal retreated, but the main question is, how about black simply doubling down on this threat, threatening mate in 1? At first, again, it looks like white just messed up, but in reality, Fischer would probably play something like pawn to b3. And all of a sudden, our queen is doing such a great job. From this advanced position, it somehow also secures white's king, making it impossible for black to deliver this check because the queen controls that square. Moreover, Stockfish actually suggests an even more brutal move, pawn to b4. I don't know if Fischer were going to play it or not, but that would be absolutely brutal. Here the idea is, it looks like it's just suicidal, opens up the king so much, but the pawn cannot be captured because that would leave the rook undefended, and white would simply grab it. And if the queen advances forward, although again it looks totally scary for white, but in reality black has not a single threat. That is just a very fun part about the position. That's why in the actual game Tal had to retreat the rook. Now Fischer grabs a pawn attacking the rook strikes back, and the bishop slides back to d3, hitting that pawn on h7 and therefore the rook. Now, that is really critical for black, and he needs to do something extraordinary to keep fighting, and Tal plays e5, opening up another discovered attack to the white queen. Now, what would you play in this position? I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about this. What black is hoping for is that white would be seduced by capturing this pawn with a check, which would lead to this trade and an endgame. An endgame is certainly better for white, but nevertheless the game goes on. Thus, Fischer decided to hit Tal where it hurts most, right in the evaluation bar, by sacrificing his queen. I guess it should feel really nice to sacrifice your queen to the Tal himself, even though I don't think that this sacrifice is something really unexpected. Because think about this, Fischer was famous for praising that e4 pawn, for calling it best, and therefore it is only expected that that pawn got so pumped up that it actually marched all the way forward right here to g7, and now it almost single-handedly wins the game for white. The annoying part for black is that he cannot even sacrifice his rook for a pawn because white's got a spare pawns. Therefore, black really needs to take away both of them. And now the black queen rushes to the king side to help black battle these advanced pawns, and the queen is transferred to the g file so that either black can capture that one or he can capture with the rook on g7. Now Fischer grabs the rook, Tal grabs one of the pawns, threatening to take the other one, but now Fischer is in time to also counter-strike and get one pawn for himself. Now there was an interesting thing that happened here. As the king moved to d8 and approached the bishop, it scolded him like, "Hey you've been standing there all day long doing nothing while we're getting destroyed." And the bishop replied, "Not true, sir. I've been guarding this crucial pawn all along." Fischer heard the dialogue, decided to help the black bishop, and played bishop e6, so that this idea is now true. The black bishop guards the pawn, and white is making use of the pin. Now, at this point, weak souls would try to step away from this X-ray and would move the king away, but Tal was a guy who always looked for counter-strikes, and he played queen h6 with a double attack. To this, Fischer replies with a trick of his own, sacrifices a bishop temporarily on d7, and then uses a pin to get it back. Tal gets a pawn, Fischer does the same, and at this point, actually white is getting a winning position. Fischer is going a little bit of back and forth. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe he just loved the fact that he's defeating Tal so much that he wanted to prolong the moment. Either way, he's now 2 pawns up, and black doesn't have much going on for him. Now white is hunting the remaining pawn. Tal is still trying to fight back and do something. g4 tries to distract the queen, and now with a couple more moves, white is approaching and finally grabbing that pawn. Now, the interesting thing about the whole rivalry between Fischer and Tal is that if we look at tournament games, then Tal is leading in score, even though some of these games were played when Fischer was only 16, not at his prime yet. However, if we take into account all the games, including Blitz and Rabbit, that these both players played, the score is actually exactly even. Therefore, it's your call. Who out of the two you prefer more? Do you love more Tal or Fischer? Let me know in the comments below. And after a couple more moves, Tal finally resigned. And if you want to know Fischer's 3 golden rules that level up your chess right away, check out this video right here.